So, you may have heard complaints about the so-called suffocating warmth of collectivism, which incidentally is the title of a new video from everyone's problematic fave, Bishop Robert Barron. But what is his video really saying? Today we're going to unpack the details and along the way uncover some true principles of economic and liberation justice. You're listening to Whiplash, a listener-supported podcast exploring Catholicism through the lens of queer liberation theology. I'm Max Kuzma, a transgender man and columnist for the National Catholic Reporter and a board member of Dignity USA. Thank you to the paid Substack subscribers who make this work possible. You want to support the show? You could be one of those paid subscribers. Today on Whiplash, we're asking a deceptively simple question. Who is liberation actually for? Increasingly, we're hearing religious leaders describe movements for economic justice, social solidarity, or structural reform as dangerous, utopian, or even spiritually corrosive. The claim is often that collective responsibility inevitably suffocates freedom, that concern for the common good somehow threatens the dignity of the individual. But when we step back and examine both Catholic social teaching and the historical realities shaping our current economic moment, that framing begins to unravel. This episode is largely a response to a recent video from Word on Fire titled The Suffocating Warmth of Marx's Collectivism, as well as a broader reflection on the public rhetoric and political positioning of Bishop Barron, who we've discussed before, both on this podcast and in essays on my Substack at maxwellkuzma.substack.com. That's also, by the way, where you can subscribe to become a paid subscriber, if you want. While the video presents itself as a warning against ideological extremism, it also raises deeper concerns about how economic ideas are being interpreted, how Catholic language is being deployed in contemporary political discourse, and how easily the line between theological reflection and partisan alignment can become blurred. When religious authority figures speak about markets, culture, and political identity, it shapes how people understand morality, belonging, and the scope of the common good. My goal here today is not to defend any single economic system, nor to romanticize any. Instead, I want to examine why simplistic dismissals of liberation-oriented thought often fail to engage the real economic conditions that many people are currently facing in this country. Liberation, properly understood, is not a zero-sum game. It is not about replacing one rigid orthodoxy or ideology for another. It is about expanding the conditions under which more people are able to live with stability, agency, and hope. If the gospel has anything to say about social life, it is that human dignity cannot be reduced to productivity, market value, or cultural conformity. So, as we start out by kind of addressing the recent video about Marx's Collectivism made by Word on Fire and Bishop Barron, we also want to take a look at some of Barron's recent actions, which in a lot of ways is a mix of action and inaction. We've talked a little bit about that in some past episodes related to his kind of weird hemming and hawing in making any statement about what went down in Minneapolis. And then there's also just, his increasing presence in highly partisan media spaces. The one that stands out to me the most is his continued appearances and contributions as an opinion writer for Fox News, which is pretty much as partisan as you can get. But he's also recently appeared on programs hosted by Tucker Carlson and also Ben Shapiro. So in these appearances, he has made arguments about Western civilization, religion, and political identity that, honestly don't really appear to kind of go along well with the Vatican's own diplomatic positions, including the Pope's repeated calls for de-escalation in the developing conflict involving Iran. Like a lot of what Barron had to say was surrounding the idea of just war theory, which there's just always going to be conversations in these Catholic bro circles about, because that's what they idolize, that's what they fantasize about, that's the whole Crusader stuff. So it's expected that Barron would be someone who would kind of if not overtly stating some of the same talking points or those same themes directly, would create some sort of framework that would allow for them, because that's kind of part of that viewpoint or that worldview, I would say. There's also, going back to March 2025, that Barron participated in the State of the Union, Trump's State of the Union. Also, apparently prior to that, he celebrated Mass for lawmakers and congressional staff, which I don't see a problem with that. But in his subsequent video that he made, which I think was almost 7 minutes long, he referred to it as the State of the Union as a kind of high liturgy of our democracy. The use of that liturgical language there, describing a partisan political gathering, raised questions for me about his understanding of the separation between church and state, as well as the meaning of liturgy within Catholic sacramental theology. So, like, if you can't, tell the difference between liturgy, which is the public worship of the church ordered towards God, and a civic political event, it definitely collapses the distinctions that Catholic theology has historically sought to maintain. He's also warned in recent media appearances, I believe this one was when he was on Tucker, that Western civilization risks collapse if society continues to marginalize religious influence. And I have to say, as somebody watching the rise of the religious right in America, not just within the way that Catholics in America have been acting, but also just the Christian nationalism of it all, and Catholic nationalism, kind of, they go hand in hand here. It just feels so wild to hear somebody vocally complaining that America isn't religious enough. It's like, what would it take? Like, what is religious enough for you? What exactly does that look like? Because right now it really does feel like the Christian nationalists are running the show. So what do you want to be different? Like, and I might be afraid to know the answer. Another person and another Catholic who has made similar remarks about Western civilization is Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who has described the US and Europe as bound together through a shared inheritance of Christian faith and Western cultural identity. And I think we all understand kind of the subtext here. So listen to this quote. He said, "We are bound to one another by the deepest bonds that nations could share, forged by centuries of shared history, Christian faith, culture, heritage, language, ancestry, and the sacrifices of our forefathers made together for the common civilization to which we have fallen heir." End quote. Okay. Like, I don't know. I mean, to me, that fits right in this Crusader core type of language where it's like, masculine victory and masculine conquest, and all those things. The subtext is text, I think, honestly. I also feel, these appeals to Western civilization. The idea is that there's this belonging idea, but it also obscures the actual realities of what has happened in history that have shaped both Europe and the United States, including things like migration, colonization, and questions about citizenship. Rubio himself was the child of two Cuban immigrants, and so there's just so much irony as well in who becomes the spokespeople for these different talking points and these different ideas. And birthright citizenship is, in fact, right now a big topic in the U.S. There's There was an executive action issued by Trump in 2025 seeking to limit citizenship for children born in the US to parents without permanent legal status. And then on April 1st, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in a case that may determine whether this longstanding constitutional interpretation will be narrowed. And there's obviously a lot of significance in the outcome of this for how national identity, legal belonging, and importantly, human dignity are understood within American political life. So just kind of like looking at all those things together, you know, it brings up questions about how religious language is being mobilized in contemporary political discourse, particularly in discussions about economics, national identity, and the role of collective responsibility. Catholic social teaching, which is mentioned in the Barron video several times, especially towards the end, has historically emphasized both the dignity of the individual person and social obligations that arise from our interdependence. When debates about economic justice are framed primarily as threats to freedom, it becomes necessary to examine whether the tradition is being interpreted in its fullness or selectively invoked to support predetermined ideological commitments. So the beginning of Barron's video really starts with industrialization and the Industrial Revolution itself, because that is the time that Marx was emerging from. I thought that Barron did actually a pretty good job with a pretty strong historical overview of how early industrial capitalism, it deeply impacted how labor was happening in society, how social belonging was happening, and even human understanding, specifically as related to our perception of ourself and our role in society, as a worker bee, and also what types of rules around working are we going to tolerate or allow. But my issue with this part is that for me, he fails to connect it to the present moment in a meaningful way. So, but let's talk a little bit more about how he describes it. So he talks about Marx's concern that workers in industrial society were experiencing multiple forms of alienation from their labor, from nature, from community, and even from themselves. I have kind of a partial quote here from the video that I'll read. I think this is from about 10 minutes in. So he said something like this: Marx felt that capitalist man was alienated in all sorts of ways. Alienated from his own freedom and productivity, because now he's being told by some hierarchy what he has to do. He's alienated from nature and alienated from himself, because he sees in the product of his labor a reflection of that alienation. Imagine someone on an assembly line, and their entire job is to take a pin and put a head on the pin. They're out of touch with nature, out of touch with their fellow human beings, forced to work against what he really wants to do. Young Marx especially is writing at a time when the capitalist political economy in the West was rather brutal. Child labor laws, restrictions on the workday, unionization, antitrust legislation, all these ways that we've reformed the excesses of capitalism. So parts of this, I think, are pretty accurate. So the Industrial Revolution did produce staggering wealth alongside staggering exploitation, and reforms such as labor protections, unionization, and antitrust regulation were hard-won responses to that human suffering. But where the analysis that Barron presents becomes less convincing for me is the suggestion or the implication that those conditions are primarily in the past. While we have made changes, like the child labor laws have happened, we've also backslid or encountered new problems. By framing the most severe distortions of capitalism as largely resolved, this video risks obscuring the ways contemporary economic life continues to generate many structural tensions that are similar to those that Marx identified, albeit in an updated technological form. I mean, just look at AI, the explosion of AI and the way that impacts almost every area of the economy, not just for the position of workers, and are workers going to be replaced, but also the impact on our communities with the explosion in building all these data centers. Our current economic moment can be understood as an extension rather than a departure from the industrial era. The shift from steam-powered manufacturing to digital infrastructure, algorithmic management, and AI-driven productivity represents not the end of industrial logic, but honestly an acceleration. So workers today may not be literally assembling pins on factory floors, but many experience similar forms of fragmentation. This feeling of being detached and doing something so abstracted or something that doesn't resonate with you. Those kinds of feelings through gig labor, precarious employment contracts, unaffordable wages, decision-making power being concentrated among a small number of firms and individuals, and also surveillance-based productivity metrics. The language of alienation continues to resonate today because underlying questions about agency, dignity, and participation have not disappeared. And here's the other part too, is that we have actual data. We have the data today to reflect this reality. Wealth concentration in the US has reached levels comparable to the Gilded Age, with the top 1% of households controlling roughly a third of total wealth, while the bottom half of the population holds only a small fraction of national assets. Over decades, policy frameworks that privilege capital gains, financialization, and shareholder primacy have accelerated this concentration, producing what some economists describe as a K-shaped recovery pattern, one in which asset owners experience significant gains, which is something that we've seen in the weird economy that we're existing in now, with all the tariffs and all the fluctuations. People who actually have assets are able to, either be fine or improve their situation, because actual assets and resources become more valuable when there's so much fluctuation. So people who already own multiple properties, that those properties have just risen in inflation, but also in value because of market instability, caused by tariffs and other interesting and crazy things like war in Iran, all that stuff. So while technological innovation has generated more productive capacity, the distribution of the gains from that remains deeply uneven. I've seen this with many companies, and this is again a pattern that began before our current moment with AI. This is a very U.S. American model. It's, you have the innovation of something new that's very valuable to people because it provides a real service, and it's something that is something that's actually beneficial. And then what ends up happening is the big money becomes interested in it because it's very profitable, so they invest in it, and then they end up hiring in at some point somebody who basically is going to come in and try to shave as much off the top as possible. I've used the example of General Electric in the past. They are a great example of how this happened. They were like a titan of American industry because they produced high quality electronics and electronic components. And then they had people come in who basically cut the costs as much as they could over and over until they weren't actually even producing any of their own products. And it's this concept where, the company becomes gutted for parts, essentially, which is very similar to, in my opinion, everyone always says Trump is such a great businessman. Well, maybe he is a great American businessman, because I think he is doing the exact same thing to the government. The same concept of cut all the things that are cut off the fat that we actually need. Like it's this, like, we need this little bit of buffer, because the thing is that when when somebody with many more resources takes away the buffer that someone with many less has because he wants to pocket the difference, that little guy is going to suffer because that assumes that nothing bad is ever going to happen. The buffer is there for unpredictable things, because unpredictable things happen all the time. And it's kind of like how we know that an extremely high percentage of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. And every time I'm driving in a big city and I see someone who is experiencing homelessness, I know when I see them that I am just one mistake, one disaster, one unexpected medical bill away from being that person. That is a reality for so many people that are living in this country today. So that was a little bit of a tangent, but coming back to Marx here, let's talk a little bit more about how, being able to recognize the complexity of the situation. Basically, we don't have to, like, when you read Marx's work, for example, you don't have to adopt his whole belief system just because I am arguing that he did see things appropriately, accurately. Like, he saw the world in an accurate way and in a way that still persists today. And also, we don't have to ignore the actual atrocities that were committed by authoritarian regimes that basically kind of claimed his legacy. However, we do have to acknowledge that the ethical questions that were raised during the industrial era are still persistent today. We have Catholic social teaching, and it emerged in response to these very tensions, seeking a path that affirms both the dignity of the individual person and the moral responsibility of society to ensure that economic structures serve the common good. When contemporary discussions present concerns about inequality or worker precarity as merely nostalgic echoes of a bygone day, they risk overlooking the degree to which industrial era dynamics continue to shape modern economic life. Now, one such echo of the industrial era to our modern time, it can be seen in a piece of art, in a piece of pop culture, which is, Barron himself in the video. He references the famous image from The Wizard of Oz, the mysterious figure behind the curtain whose authority depends on maintaining the illusion of unquestionable power. The metaphor is meant to suggest that Marxist analysis asks us to look behind cultural narratives in order to see the economic forces shaping social life. Barron presents this as a problem because he understands culture as emerging primarily from the moral and theological inheritance of Western Christianity, and therefore interprets attempts to, quote, look behind the curtain as efforts to destabilize what he sees as the legitimate spiritual foundations of this Western social order. Interestingly to me, the cultural resonance of Oz has resurfaced in recent years through renewed interest in things like the adaptations of Wicked, the musical, into the movie, suggesting that questions about illusion, authority, and power continue to feel relevant to us. L. Frank Baum's original 1900 novel emerged from a specific historical context that was shaped by economic instability in American expansionism. Before he eventually settled in Chicago, Baum spent several years in South Dakota during a prolonged drought and regional economic depression. These experiences complicated his understanding of this dominant mythology of the great American frontier, a landscape of unlimited opportunity, because instead he encountered a reality marked by environmental fragility, vast economic issues and widespread disillusionment among other people who had also kind of believed this vision in this dream. So within that perspective or that context, you can look at Oz more than just as a children's fantasy story, but as a story that reflects some of the contradictions of late 19th century American development. A world in which prosperity and insecurity coexist, and where authority depends on carefully maintained narratives of legitimacy. The enduring appeal of the story may lie in its recognition that power frequently operates through perception, symbolism, and the management of belief. In the Word on Fire video, Barron attempts to acknowledge that Marx was responding to real suffering, but quickly pivots to the historical examples of regimes associated with Lenin and Stalin, and this idea of this leads directly to death camps, invoking familiar warnings that attempts to radically restructure economic life can produce devastating human consequences, which is true. Basically any big dramatic change can have the effect of, you know, people's deaths, suffering, etc. Like, I learned recently that when it came to the reopening of the Berlin Wall, it was supposed to be done slowly, but the message didn't reach the actual person, the man who was in charge of opening it, and he just opened it immediately, which caused a bunch of chaos. So, yeah, anything that is done hastily and in extreme ways, there are consequences, absolutely. The broader concern that Barron has in the video is that collectivist frameworks risk subordinating the individual to the group, potentially justifying coercion in the name of social progress. Historical tragedies, that we're talking about do deserve serious attention, and Catholic social teaching has consistently rejected political systems that deny the inherent dignity and freedom of the human person. But at the same time, focusing exclusively on the most catastrophic distortions of collectivist thought can obscure the ways that coercive pressures already operate within contemporary economic systems, particularly when individuals lack meaningful access to healthcare, housing, or stable employment. Specifically, at one point, they talk about Mamdani because there was this idea of the warmth of collectivism from him specifically. And Barron, in hearing that message, I think it was it may have originally been a speech and then turned into a tweet, but Barron responded to it like as a tweet on social media. He views that collectivism as implying or saying that the individual is expendable, and that what's more important is our group identity. So you take away individuals' freedom and disaster follows. He says, I don't think collectivism is warm at all. Show me one example. And yet, here's the thing, is that the quote they actually read from Mamdani in the video actually, to me, includes those examples. Here's part of what he said, quote, let us prove that when a city belongs to the people, there is no need too small to be met, no person too sick to be made healthy, no one too alone to feel like New York is their home. So I really feel like, he provided examples of what he meant and what he was talking about. We want to have people know that they have belonging. We want people to have healthcare. Like that's pretty specific to me. I mean, I don't know. That's what I thought. I also just sort of just felt like the subtext is that the reason that they don't like Mamdani is because he's Muslim. Like, and I'm not saying that they presented an Islamophobic perspective in the video overtly. I'm just saying, if you are going to say that Western culture is, the supreme thing, and that your church, Catholicism, represents Western culture in that way, then clearly you're going to see any true, genuine cultural diversity as some sort of threat to that, which feels just so at odds with the very pastoral way that Mamdani has actually acted in specifically showing and demonstrating care for all members of the community, not just Muslims, for example. Like, Mamdani isn't like, I'm only a mayor for Muslims, you know what I mean? So anyway, there's a lot to unpack there. But they also then move on in the video to identity politics, which always annoys me because, again, it's like, we're just going to slap kind of like thought terminating cliches. If I just say identity politics, then you can just shut your brain off whenever LGBTQ issues come up because it's like, oh, that's just identity politics. I don't care about that. But, the truth is, and also there's an implication that it is a one unified belief system or whatever the case may be. We've talked about this with gender ideology, pointing out that, this idea is preposterous because, gender ideology is grouping together a lot of different things, from the experience of trans people to like academic fields that are actually very distinct and different. So similarly, with identity politics, communities such as groups of LGBTQ people are not monolithic ideological blocks, but complex and internally diverse groups whose members hold a wide range of perspectives on economics, culture, and public life. Because the thing is that LGBTQ people, it's not like there's a factory where LGBTQ people come out of and that they're only from one part of society. They can be born into any part of society. That's because they're people. LGBTQ people are people. Like, we're going to be in every part of society because we're just like anybody else. We're going to have every type of different identity, that can be every different type of culture. And I really think it's important to say that shared identity categories do not automatically produce this so-called groupthink. Rather, they often emerge from the need to articulate common experiences of marginalization. That's another word that I think people often turn their mind off when they hear. But it's very dangerous to do that because marginalization is real and it is a complex subject that really affects people, especially poor people, the people that Jesus really commands us to be with. But yeah, authentic diversity reflects the presence of genuinely different experiences, viewpoints, and forms of expertise that can contribute to more thoughtful and inclusive decision-making processes across society. And that includes a variety of cultures, not just this capital W Western society that we're hearing so much about. So Barron also raises concern in response to a question. I think the question was basically like, how is it that things that are dangerous can be wrapped in such good language, like the language of justice, inequality, or human rights? He literally said he sees it as sweet poison, which I thought was kind of wild that he said that. But it suggests that appealing moral language can conceal harmful ideological agendas, which I think is true. I mean, that's fair, but just this idea that maybe painting with a broad stroke that anybody who is trying to work for those things and calling for those things, you've automatically cast it as something that you're going to ignore. And I really am bringing that up a few times because I think that's really important. Even Catholic tradition, it resists this. It focuses on calling out that social structures can and should be evaluated according to how well they promote the flourishing of the most vulnerable. Like, that is like Catholic social teaching 101. So, if you pretend that there is no vulnerable social suffering because we've solved all these problems during the Industrial Revolution, then you're literally like blind to the actual material realities of what is going on in the present moment, Or if you, even if you're not pretending about that in a historical way, if you have these thought terminating cliches these terms that don't, that allow you to group people and then not actually see the reality of what people experience, I think it's really, really dangerous. But again, to give Barron some credit, he does insist on the importance of Catholic social teaching. I'm not sure he fully understands it. He does say that it's not left or right, which is true. So I do like that part. But he also interprets it as supporting a quote, morally regulated market economy. Not his quote. I'm just kind of terminating that. Basically capable of expanding participation. That comes from JP2, and reducing poverty that way. Again, I mean, just another theory, another way of looking at it. Catholic tradition does affirm the legitimacy of private property, but within the broader principle of the universal destination of goods, the idea that the earth's resources are intended for the benefit of all. That principle actually appears repeatedly throughout scripture and tradition. So ancient Israelite law, for example, required landowners to leave the edges of their fields unharvested so that the poor and the stranger could gather food. The Jubilee tradition described in Leviticus mandated periodic debt forgiveness and the restoration of land to original families, preventing permanent concentration of wealth across generations. Interesting. These practices reflect a long-standing recognition that economic systems must be structured in ways that preserve both stability and access to material resources necessary for human dignity. So, all of these themes highlight an ongoing tension within Catholic thought. How to affirm both individual agency and social responsibility without collapsing into ideological extremes. The question is not whether markets exist or whether collective action is ever justified, but how economic arrangements can be evaluated according to their effects on real human communities. When discussions about collectivism or markets rely primarily on abstract warnings or simplified historical analogies, they risk overlooking the degree to which economic life is always shaped by moral choices, institutional frameworks, and evolving historical conditions. So one of the strengths of Catholic social thought is that it tries to resist overly simplistic binaries. They mention this in the video, this idea of both and. And another Catholic writer who's just talked about this is Mark Shea, who describes the tradition's instinct as opposed to either or type of thinking. So some questions are binary. For example, classical Christianity insists that Jesus is both fully human and fully divine, but many modern political arguments present false choices that flatten reality. Catholic social teaching has historically tried to hold together truths that are often placed in opposition: individual dignity and social responsibility, personal initiative and collective care, markets and moral limits. When the tradition is presented as automatically endorsing an ideological framework, whether it be capitalist or socialist, or even Eastern or Western, something important is lost. The Catholic intellectual tradition is more flexible, more historically aware, and more cautious about absolute claims than our media environment in the US often allows for. If we look at it this way, the work of Karl Marx becomes easier to situate without either demonizing or romanticizing it. He was responding to very real conditions during the Industrial Revolution: dangerous working environments, extreme wealth inequality, and political systems that gave ordinary workers very little influences over the forces shaping their lives, a lot like today. Looking at the evidence available to him, including revolutions in Europe and the United States, along with the issue of slavery and wars fought over it, Marx concluded that entrenched power rarely gives way voluntarily. His analysis assumed that structural change would likely be necessary to curb exploitation. While many of his predictions did not unfold exactly as he imagined, his critique of concentrated economic power still helps explain why questions about wages, labor protections, and corporate influence remain so persistent today. Recognizing this does not require agreeing with every conclusion he reached or every movement that claimed to follow his thinking. It simply acknowledges that his work emerged from a serious attempt to interpret a rapidly changing world. It is also worth remembering that the political regimes most often associated with Marx developed under conditions quite different from the industrial societies that he expected would produce revolution. 20th century communist governments arose in economically unstable or authoritarian contexts where leaders were using Marxist language to justify consolidating power rather than dismantling it. That's huge. The human cost of those regimes cannot be ignored. But reducing Marx's entire intellectual contribution to those outcomes risks oversimplifying the story. Like many major thinkers, he was responding to real problems, even if some of his proposed solutions proved flawed or vulnerable to misuse by those seeking power. From a theological perspective, Christianity consistently frames moral authority in terms of solidarity with those pushed to the margins. We know this. The Gospels portray Jesus repeatedly confronting systems that concentrate power. His kingship is not expressed through domination, but precisely through identification with those who lack status or protection. That pattern does not belong to a single economy or economic blueprint, but it does establish a moral orientation or direction. Social structures should be judged, at least in part, by how they affect those with the least access to stability and a voice. When all this wealth and decision-making power becomes so highly concentrated, the tradition invites renewed reflection about whether those arrangements actually serve the common good. And I'd like to say, too, that these questions became especially visible in the development of liberation theology in the mid 20th century in Latin America, where theologians and local Catholic communities attempted to interpret the gospel in the context of widespread poverty and political repression. During the Cold War, liberation theology was often viewed with suspicion because of its perceived proximity to socialist thought and communism, and political actors frequently positioned it as a threat, and still do today. At the same time, many of its central insights, including the idea that material conditions shape human dignity, draw directly from long-standing Catholic commitments to solidarity and the preferential option for the poor. And in many ways, liberation theology is intrinsically interconnected with Catholic social teaching. And the father of liberation theology, Gustavo Gutierrez, even concelebrated Mass with Pope Francis. So it's not as if the Pope or the Vatican threw out liberation theology. We have a Pope who actually participated in it and lifted it up, and we now have a Pope Leo, who has continued to lift up Catholic social teaching. I also think it's worth putting a word in here about how Catholic identity in the U.S. has been very complicated. Originally a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment that slowly started to change when evangelical movements in the country began to kind of mobilize more with things like the moral majority in the 1980s. And then now, in today, we had figures like J.D. Vance, who had his conversion to Catholicism, trying to get the Catholic vote, and then groups like the Heritage Foundation, many the architects of Project 2025, and many of the people involved in that were Catholics, and some involvement of Opus Dei. But then it's also still complicated because despite mobilizing this Catholic population in the U.S. for for a specific end with a specific goal, at the same time, there was the recent decision by the Pentagon to exclude Catholics from Good Friday services. So it's still a complex subject that, basically what I'm trying to say is, tying your horse to that wagon may not be the best choice, because just because, there was this movement within MAGA that brought together, Catholics and Protestants, doesn't mean that the Protestants necessarily absolve the Catholics of all their disagreements. Just because everybody's saying Western civilization doesn't mean that each person has their own, or each group has their own idea of what that is. In the Word on Fire video, when, quote, the Catholic position is invoked as if it were settled once and for all, to me, that feels exclusionary and overly rigid, rather than a genuine theological reflection, because it's this black and white thinking. It's this binary of this is how it is, when in reality, Catholic tradition has actually always developed through debate, disagreement, and ongoing engagement with new historical and scientific realities. Despite the fact that some people have this romanticized idea of an unchanging tradition we can always point back to, it's just not true. That's just not how Catholicism has ever worked. Problems arise when complex issues are reduced to slogans, or when disagreement is framed as disloyalty rather than part of faithful discernment and, the primacy of conscience. Like, we're just throwing all that out the window. Social psychologists sometimes refer to this pattern as a form of internal policing, where communities maintain cohesion by rewarding conformity and discouraging critical engagement. One common feature of these environments is the use of thought-terminating cliches that I mentioned earlier, phrases that kind of sound meaningful maybe, but function mainly as a way to shut down deeper inquiry. So an example would be a statement like Marxism is evil. And some of these statements may contain elements of truth in certain contexts, but when repeated as blanket expectations or explanations, they often prevent more careful analysis of actual economic conditions and reality. So Catholic intellectual tradition at its best encourages the opposite posture: careful reasoning, attention to historical context, and openness to complexity. Ultimately, the goal is not to replace one rigid ideology with another, but to remain attentive to the moral questions that economic life inevitably raises. Catholic social teaching provides a framework for evaluating systems according to their effects on human dignity, participation, and the distribution of resources necessary for flourishing. That process requires humility, curiosity, and a willingness to resist easy answers. The tradition's strength lies precisely in its ability to hold tension without collapsing into these false ideas that, we have all the easy answers. Instead, we trust that the pursuit of truth is rarely served by oversimplification. So, in conclusion here, liberation is not a suffocating force. It is the expansion of human dignity and the restoration of breadth within social systems that too often narrow the possibilities of who is allowed to flourish. The Christian tradition is at its best when it does not demand allegiance to a single economic ideology, but instead insists that economic life be ordered toward the common good, the dignity of labor, and the universal destination of goods. The fact that this is a shared planet that we all live on, and that we are all stewards of it together. When liberation is framed as inherently dangerous or this false utopian, we should ask who benefits from that framing, especially in a moment of widening inequality and increasing concentration of power. The gospel consistently shows Christ aligning himself not with those who consolidate wealth and authority, but with those rendered marginal, excluded, or economically vulnerable. A faithful reading of Catholic social teaching challenges both unrestrained capitalism and authoritarian collectivism, precisely because it resists the simplistic either-or narratives and instead calls for moral imagination capable of responding to real human conditions. Liberation, in this sense, is not ideological fantasy, but a recognition that economic and political systems should serve human flourishing rather than demand human diminishment. At the same time, this language of capital T truth can easily become a mechanism of internal policing when complex realities are reduced to slogans or thought-terminating cliches. High control dynamics rely on narrowing the boundaries of what is acceptable to think, discouraging inquiry and curiosity, and framing dissent as a moral failure rather than part of faithful discernment. Catholic intellectual tradition has historically been strongest when it encourages rigorous dialogue, humility, and attentiveness to lived experience. Liberation theology itself emerged from communities attempting to understand how the gospel speaks within conditions of structural inequality, reminding us that theology is always shaped by historical context. Theology is shaped by the example of Jesus, not by what Aristotle wrote. You know what I mean? Like, it matters more how Jesus acted, how he lived, and what he said than what Aristotle or Aquinas said. It's just true. When calls for economic justice are dismissed as inherently dangerous, or collectivism is just inherently dangerous, this often obscures coercive pressures that are already embedded within existing systems, from things like debt and economic precarity to barriers to participation in public life for people who have less wealth. Liberation is not about replacing one rigid orthodoxy or ideology with another. It is again about creating conditions in which more people can meaningfully participate in the common good. The Christian story reveals that true authority is expressed through solidarity rather than domination, and that any society committed to human dignity must remain open to ongoing reform, deeper inclusion, and the possibility that justice can expand rather than contract our shared life. Rather than treating economic questions as a simple contest between competing ideologies, Catholicism invites us to a broader moral horizon, one that considers how social arrangements shape people's ability to live with security, agency, and hope. The Catholic intellectual tradition offers resources for thinking beyond rigid political categories, reminding us that authentic human flourishing depends on both personal dignity and shared responsibility. If liberation means anything within a Christian framework, it points toward a world where systems are continually evaluated as to how well they allow human life in all its complexity to thrive.